Well, future nephews and nieces, if you look back on this period, you might come across a term called woke. And you might be wondering what woke is. And it's a little confusing because different people have different definitions of it. Some people see woke as a good thing. They see it as awareness of the social injustices being inflicted upon vulnerable or marginalized groups, oftentimes minority groups. Other people define woke as a bad thing. They use it as a pejorative. If you're a woke person, that means you're a radical left-wing progressive with ridiculous ideas and you're unjust. Now I have my own definition of woke, and I think it describes it pretty accurately. Woke to me means that you have good, well-intentioned progressive ideas, but you push it to a point where it becomes ridiculous and stupid. And I'll give you a few examples of this. I would say the first big woke movement was the Black Lives Matter movement that started in 2012. And what happened was this teenager, Trayvon Martin, was walking around in his neighborhood, and a security officer patrolling that neighborhood stopped him. Now, according to the security officer, an altercation ensued. Trayvon Martin attacked him, and he ended up shooting him to protect himself. Now, the security officer did have some wounds on the back of his head, which would support his story, but there was never video evidence of the altercation. So the black community was extremely upset because Trayvon Martin hadn't done anything wrong. He was just walking around in his neighborhood. And it looked like he was racially profiled by the security officer. But eventually, this security officer was acquitted of any wrongdoing and he was set free. Then in 2016, I think there was two incidents. One happened to a man named Eric Gardner. The police were arresting him, I believe, for selling just single cigarettes to people, like for 10 or 20 cents. Seemed like a rather harmless offense to me, but they wanted to bring him in. But then the officers brought their aggression to a whole new level. I mean, one guy put him in a chokehold and they kind of tackled him. Eric Garner started screaming that he couldn't breathe. They ended up killing him. I don't think it was on purpose, but I do believe they were acting negligently. Now, in a second incident, a man named Philando Castile, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, was pulled over. And he was pretty upfront with the officer. I think he was trying to let the officer know that, hey, he did have a gun, not to be threatening, but just to let the officer know so if the officer did do a search, he would know Philando Castile had a gun. But when he was reaching for his ID, the officer just pulled out a gun and shot him. And in both these instances, the police officers got off. So understandably, the black community was extremely angry. Now in 2020, there was a pivotal moment with a man named George Floyd. He was arrested for passing counterfeit bills at a liquor store or convenience store. And when they arrested him, he was resisting arrest. I mean, I saw the video. They put him in the back of a police car and he was kicking and screaming and going nuts. So they pulled him out of the car, but then an officer named Derek Chauvin put his knee on George Floyd's neck. He kept his knee on George Floyd's neck, I think for 5 minutes, but then after George Floyd passed out, he continued holding his knee on top of George Floyd's neck. Now eventually George Floyd died. But this time there was something different. There was so much outrage, and I think it had a lot to do with the video that was released, because when you see it, it's pretty despicable what happened. To see these police officers have so little regard for this man's life. And a bunch of protests broke out and riots broke out. I remember a police station being burned. I mean, people were extremely angry. But there was a different result this time. Derek Chauvin actually went to jail, and even the police officers who stood by and watched him put his knee on George Floyd's neck and did nothing to intervene or help, they also went to jail. Being a police officer is a tough job. I've talked to police officers before, and yeah, some of the people they have to deal with is pretty rough. But when a police officer is egregious in his actions and abuses his or her power, they need to be held accountable. So overall, I think the Black Lives Matter movement was a good thing because it started holding police officers accountable for their actions. It showed that even these law enforcement officers were not above the law. But then it started morphing into this movement called Defund the Police. Now, Defund the Police was about taking money away from police departments and putting it towards social programs to try to help ensure the public safety. Now, I have no problems with funding social programs, but the idea that taking money away from the police departments was a good idea was just asinine. I mean, police departments around the country were already stressed. They were having a very difficult time trying to hire enough officers. And a lot of the poorer minority communities also thought defund the police was a dumb idea because the police department was the only thing protecting them. I mean, rich people could hire security guards, but these people had nobody except for the police. Now, thankfully, as of this recording, I think defund the police has pretty much gone away because people realized it was a dumb idea and they've dropped it. So another big woke movement happened around 2017 when an actress named Alyssa Milano tweeted out that women who had been sexually harassed or sexually assaulted should reply to her tweet with "Me Too." And a whole bunch of women responded. And women started sharing their stories. This turned into a huge movement. Finally, women started gaining some power, and women had a voice to fight against a bunch of prominent men who had used their power to take advantage of women. The most notable person who went down during the Me Too movement was Harvey Weinstein. He was this big movie producer. Now, he was notorious for using his power to take advantage of women. But then there was accusations of rape and sexual assault. And he was eventually convicted. And from what I understand, to this day, he's still in jail. But like most woke movements, it went off the rails. People started believing women's accusations without any evidence, proof, or investigations. There were some Democrats, including the presidential candidate Joe Biden, who said women should be believed. No, they shouldn't. Women are just like any other person. They can lie. Now, women should be taken seriously. If a woman makes an accusation, an investigation should be done. And if it's true what the woman is saying, then whoever did the sexual harassing or sexual assault should be held accountable and face the consequences of their actions. But you shouldn't just believe somebody just because they're a woman. That's a ridiculous idea. So then eventually Joe Biden gets accused of sexual assault. And all of a sudden, he says, what I mean by women should be believed is that they should be taken seriously and their accusations should be investigated. Go figure. Now, don't get me wrong. I think the Me Too movement was very important and it did a lot of good things. It started holding these men accountable for their sexual harassment and sexual assault. But like other woke movements, I think it just went too far. So the last thing I want to talk to you about is DEI. I'm going to read from my notes because I want to get this right. So DEI stands for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. and it's the promoting the fair treatment and full participation of all people, particularly groups who have been historically underrepresented or discriminated against. So that sounds like a great idea. Who could argue with that? The problem is DEI also pushes this initiative called affirmative action. And affirmative action essentially gives advantages to certain groups based off of their race, their sex, their sexuality, and so forth. So I'll give you an example. When my mom was working as a manager at a tech company, there weren't that many Black or Hispanic employees. So when a Black or Hispanic person came and applied, it was an automatic interview. So my mom interviewed this one Black guy, but he wasn't qualified. But the human resources department asked her, could you keep the position open and have him go back to school to get the proper qualifications? So my mom agreed, and he went to college, took the necessary course, and she gave him the job. Now, in this instance, everything worked out well because the guy she hired turned out to be hardworking, intelligent, and he worked well with the group. But there were some affirmative action hires that didn't work out too well. I mean, they were slow, difficult to work with, and not very good employees. I read a book once where an author said that you should hire less qualified people when you're doing a startup if that person will promote diversity. And I thought that idea was just completely ridiculous. I mean, she sounded like somebody who had never done a startup before. When you're doing a startup, you're flying by the seat of your pants. You're just trying to get the product done and done correctly. Because ultimately, the end user doesn't care about the race, the sex, or the sexuality of the person who programmed an app or a website. All they care about is, does it work? I also remember there was this Black commentator on PBS who said that affirmative action was very personal to him because he claimed without affirmative action, he wouldn't have been able to attend a very good college, which he attributed to his success today. But then I thought, what about that person who was more qualified, who didn't make it into that college because he or she wasn't the right race? Is that fair? And actually, there was a court case where an Asian family sued Harvard because what they found out was that there were Black and Hispanic students that had lower test scores than some Asian students, but the Black and Hispanic students were being admitted and the Asian students were being rejected. These Asian students were being discriminated against because of affirmative action. Yet we Asians only make up 6 or 7% of the population. Since when did we stop being a minority group? It seemed like because a bunch of Asians went to college and were successful, we were getting penalized. And what the Supreme Court ultimately decided was that it was unconstitutional for a college to use race as a determining factor for admission. And let me be clear, I'm not saying that Asian people should get special treatment. In fact, I don't want that. All I want is for people to be judged on their merit. I believe we should strive for a meritocracy. And it's important to note that the people who can take advantage of affirmative action may not even benefit from it. I remember this Hispanic student in high school who got into UCLA, and he knew he got into UCLA because of his race. Because he compared his GPA to some of his friends' GPAs who didn't make it. And his GPA was actually lower than theirs, but he got accepted and they didn't. This student wasn't sure if he should go to UCLA because of this. Of course, all the class was telling him, yeah, you should take advantage of your opportunities. But he was hesitant because he was afraid that he couldn't compete with the other students if he did go. And I thought this was a very mature way of looking at things because I did hear that there were a lot of students who, when they got admitted to these higher end colleges, they would drop out. I think affirmative action can be a good thing if you apply it correctly. In this example, I would say you should try to make K through 12 schools a lot better, especially in marginalized communities. And then you prepare the student for college so that when they get to college, they get in based off of their merit, not because of their race. So, in my view, when I look at DEI and affirmative action, I think they mean well, but when I see how they're implemented, I don't think it's fair, and I think it actually does more harm than good. So I would like to end this video today by saying I actually think progressives are very important in the world. They push societies forward and they push the human race forward. I think the founding fathers were progressives. They rebelled against a monarchy and established a republic. I think the abolitionists were progressives. They wanted to get rid of this antiquated system of slavery. I think the people who participated in the civil rights movement were progressives. They wanted equality in voting, in schools, and in opportunities. Sometimes these progressives go too far, and when they go too far, you need conservatives to rein them in. So, future nephews and nieces, I hope you have a better understanding of what woke means. And if you're studying this era, yes, there were many progressives who had crazy ideas. The problem is the conservatives of this era were even crazier and more ridiculous. But that's a topic of another video.